A huge update in the Luigi Mangione case. A New York judge seemingly sided with the defense and dismissed 2 of his charges related to the murder of UnitedHealthcare CEO Brian Thompson. We're breaking down the latest as state prosecutors are still pushing for a trial date to get on the calendar. Thanks for joining us on Law and Crime. I'm Elizabeth Millner. On Tuesday, a New York judge threw out the terrorism charges against Luigi Mangione, but also one of the other severe charges, including first-degree murder. Supporters of Luigi Mangione arrived bright and early Tuesday morning with their Free Luigi shirts and hats to get a glimpse of the 27-year-old. Tuesday marked Luigi's first court appearance in New York State court since February. His attorneys were hoping to have his state charges dropped. The defense claims that the terrorism charges were legally insufficient, and they moved to dismiss the entire indictment because they believed it violated double jeopardy and argued the state case should be stayed pending the results of the ongoing federal case, too. But here's what the judge decided to do. Judge Gregory Caro ruled to dismiss 2 murder charges related to acts of terrorism. So what that means is the judge is saying counts 1 and 2 of the indictment are out. Now, those charges were murder in the first degree in furtherance of an act of terrorism and second-degree murder as a crime of terrorism. The judge tossed those counts out because he ruled they were legally insufficient. In his 12-page ruling, Justice Caro first started off with the facts of the case. On December 4th, Brian Thompson was gunned down outside of a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. Video surveillance showed a man in a mask, wearing all black, carrying a backpack, draw their gun, and shoot the CEO in the back and the leg. Right before the shooting, though, that same man drank from a water bottle, threw it in the trash can, he dropped his cell phone, and even disposed of the backpack in Central Park. Now, when investigators recovered ballistics from the scene, there were 3 now infamous shell casing: depose, delay, and deny written on them. If you've been following the case, then you know what happens next. Investigators traced the shooter's movements to a hostel in Upper Manhattan. The shooter allegedly used a fake ID with the name Mark Rosario on it, and that eventually led investigators to Pennsylvania. 5 days after Brian Thompson was killed, Luigi was arrested at a McDonald's in Altoona. A 9mm gun was recovered from his backpack, as well as ammunition, a silencer, a fake New Jersey driver's license with the name Mark Rosario on it, cash, a passport, and a notebook with Luigi's alleged journal entries. According to court documents, there were 2 letters in the backpack, one addressed to his family and one addressed to the FBI. Ballistic analysis shows that the shell casings recovered from the scene were fired by the gun found in his backpack, and his DNA was found on the water bottle found at the scene and on the cell phone and backpack thrown out by the shooter, including fingerprints also found on the water bottle and Kind Bar wrapper. Now, you might be thinking, eek, that's a lot of evidence. How did the judge drop charges despite all of that? Well, he had his reason. According to his ruling, the people, or state prosecutors, argued Luigi's alleged journal entries found in his backpack were evidence of terroristic intent. But the judge says those writings ultimately don't aid the state's argument. The judge wrote, quote, "The defendant's apparent objective, as stated in his writings, was not to threaten, intimidate, or coerce, but rather to draw attention to what he perceived as the greed of the insurance industry, and as additional possible consequence to negatively affect the financials of the company. The defendant emphasized that he wished to spread a message and win public support about everything wrong with our health system. The defendant explicitly contrasted himself with Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, because he indiscriminately mail-bombed innocents and crossed the line to terrorists, the worst thing a person can be." The judge went on to write, quote, "While defendant's own characterization of his conduct is of course not despotive, where there is no other evidence of terroristic intent, the writings fail to supply that evidence contrary to the people's characterization. The people presented sufficient evidence that the defendant murdered Brian Thompson in a premeditated and calculated execution. That does not mean, however, the defendant did so with terroristic intent." State prosecutors have alleged that UnitedHealthcare employees felt fearful after Brian Thompson's murder, and some even got personal threats. But the judge said employees were receiving threats even before Thompson was murdered. However, in his ruling, he wrote, quote, "Every murder has the potential to induce some degree of fear. Even making the comparison, if a murder happens on the subway, riders may feel fearful, but that fails to establish the defendant's intent or if the conduct fits the statutory definition of terrorism." In his ruling, he wrote, quote, "While there is no doubt that the crime at issue here is not ordinary street crime, it does not follow that all non-street crimes were meant to be included within the reach of the terrorism statute. While the people place great emphasis on defendants' ideological motive, there is no indication in the statute that a murder committed for ideological reasons, in this case, the defendant's apparent desire to draw attention to what he perceived as inequities or greed within the American healthcare system, fits within the definition of terrorism without establishing the necessary element of an intent to intimidate or coerce. Now, according to the Associated Press, the New York State courthouse erupted with the sounds of cheers and claps when news came down that terrorism charges were dropped. But for the defense and even his supporters, he isn't completely out of the wind. He still faces second-degree murder, plus other charges like criminal possession of a weapon, criminal possession of a loaded firearm, possession of a forged instrument, criminal possession of an assault rifle, criminal possession of an ammo clip, and criminal possession of a ghost gun. And that's just in the New York State case. In his federal case in New York, he's charged with 2 counts of stalking, 1 count of murder through use of a firearm, plus another charge for a firearms offense. And in his state charge in Pennsylvania, he's facing charges for carrying a gun without a license, forgery, falsely identifying himself to authorities, and possessing instruments of crime. So what's next for Luigi? Well, it's a race to see who will try the case first, state prosecutors in New York or Pennsylvania, or the federal prosecutors who are seeking the death penalty. I'm joined now by attorney Rich Schoenstein. Rich, always great to see you, and thanks so much for joining me today. Are you surprised the judge dropped the terrorism charges in Luigi's state case?
I am surprised, I will say. And I will say 2 slightly contradictory things.
Okay.
One is, I always thought the terrorism part of this charge was a stretch and was going to be difficult for the prosecutors to sustain, but I am surprised that the judge booted it out of the case before trial. I have both of those views.
And what are your thoughts on his ruling where he said UnitedHealthcare employees were already receiving threats even prior to Brian Thompson's murder, but particularly the line where he said every murder has the potential to induce some degree of fear, but that it doesn't necessarily mean it fits the definition of terrorism under the statute?
I agree with that. I read through his analysis. I thought it's a pretty well-reasoned, pretty concise opinion. I'll tell you one line that stood out. He says, on page 5 in the legal analysis, the court will note that the term terrorism has been famously difficult to define. And that to me is exactly the point. It is incapable of a precise definition. There's no metric involved. You don't have to kill a certain number of people or shoot after a certain number of people or make a particular demand or have a particular goal in mind to be terrorism. And the fact that members of the insurance industry were already concerned because of public feelings about the insurance industry, that doesn't take it out of the ambit of terrorism at all, as far as I'm concerned. So I thought it was a pretty well-written decision. At bottom, I disagree with it.
Interesting. And elaborate more on that.
Well, I think so the reason I disagree with it is I think it should be up to the jury. I think it's not entirely clear without a fulsome presentation of the evidence at trial what was the motive for this crime and what was the intent of the crime. And if it could be proved beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury that this shooting was done precisely to cause fear among members of the insurance industry, or to bring attention to it, or to spur government action, or to create some change, that to me potentially brings it into the ambit of terrorism, at least enough that I would afford 12 individual jurors the opportunity to come together, debate the issue, and reach a decision. And they may not think it's terrorism at the end of the day, which is fine. That's how the justice system works. But I don't know about taking it away from them as a possibility. I don't agree with the judge taking it out of the jury's hand at this juncture.
And it seemed like overall, the Luigi alleged diary entries or journal entries were kind of the center of the terrorism charge even being brought against him in state court. And the writings were pretty interesting, and I'll say that kind of loosely here, where he allegedly compared himself to the Unabomber, but claimed that the Unabomber took it a step further by murdering civilians. Whereas if these were writings from Luigi, as prosecutors allege them to be, it seems like they kind of have a strong argument for premeditation, because the gist of the murder for Brian Thompson was intended to bring this revolutionary change to the healthcare industry, instead of taking the route where it was targeting innocent civilians in a way, that instead it was really directed and planned out for the CEO. But what's your take on that?
Right. Well, it was definitely premeditated. I mean, premeditated means it was planned, and this was immaculately planned. He traveled across stage lines. By the way, I'm making the assumption that the allegations are accurate for the purpose of this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
He is, of course, afforded the right to a fair trial. He is innocent until proven guilty, and that still has to be proved at trial. And unless that happens at trial, he's not found guilty. But to have this discussion, I have to assume that some of this evidence is accurate. And if the evidence is accurate, the fact that he would compare himself in his own writings to a terrorist, to me, is part of the interesting point here, right? He thought he was creating terror. Possibly he intended to create terror or fear or doubt or something, instill some feeling in the insurance industry that would cause change. This wasn't a personal crime, as I understand it. He wasn't mad at Brian Thompson because Brian Thompson individually did something to him, denied a claim, hurt his family. He wasn't going after him man and man. He was going after him as a figurehead of something much larger, which means he was trying to send a message that was much larger, and I think could be interpreted. And you talk about the writings, and I don't know if you're going to get to it, but of course, then we have the engravings on the bullet casings that also are there to send a message to the public after this crime is committed. So it's not just about shooting and killing a particular person. It's about more than that.
Yeah, and it seemed like the plan was kind of already set in stone, because I think in one court document, prosecutors were alleging that Luigi allegedly was kind of staking out the place. He had run into Brian Thompson the day prior, and all of this just very interesting information that we've been seeing kind of in court filings coming out over the past few months. And does it come as a surprise to you that the judge rejected the double jeopardy argument? I mean, we've seen plenty of state cases that are parallel in a way to federal cases, but are you surprised that the defense really possibly thought they had an argument for double jeopardy there?
No, I'm not surprised the defense made the argument, and I'm not surprised that it was rejected for the reasons you say, and because they're different crimes. And of course, that's very important right now, because even if we've taken the highest charge off the table in New York, the federal charges carry not only a life imprisonment without parole possibility, but possibility of the death penalty. And it may be we might see the federal charges now leapfrog the state charges, especially with what seems to be the federal government's interest in this case. We might see those charges push ahead of the state charges and become even more aggressive in light of what now has happened in state court.
And do you think that this changes anything for his federal case, in terms of maybe possibly a federal judge could drop a couple charges in his federal case too?
No, it doesn't. There's not a terrorism aspect to the federal case. In many ways, the federal case is an easier sell. The thing that gets you to the death penalty in the federal case is killing somebody with a gun. And that obviously happened here. Now, you still have to go to a jury. You still have to go and check all the aggravating and mitigating circumstances and get a jury on board with it. But it's a much clearer path to a death eligible crime under the federal system. And it wasn't about terrorism at all in the federal case. And therefore, the state case shouldn't really affect that. It shouldn't affect the judge's thinking.
And in your opinion, when we look at the kind of laundry list in a way of Luigi's charges that he's facing in state court in Pennsylvania, in New York, and federal court. Do you think that prosecutors, because I remember I think you might have remembered too, when the case first came down and it just seemed like everyone just kind of wanted in a way to take a bite out of him, where they might have been overcharging. Some people could argue that prosecutors were overcharging him in his cases, but what are your thoughts? Do you think that this was an overcharge in the case when I'm talking right now about the New York State case? Do you think it was overcharged? What are your thoughts overall?
I don't think it was overcharged. I know there's a lot of commentators who think it was overcharged from the beginning. I thought it was a bit of a stretch. It's somewhat a novel theory. It is not clearly defined, as the judge said, and it made the burden of proof harder. I will say this for the state case. In some ways, this makes the state's burden much easier. Right? If they go to trial without having to demonstrate that there's an act of terrorism here, all they have to demonstrate is a premeditated act of murder. They have a much easier time meeting the burden of proof. It's much harder to think of jury nullification if it's just a question of whether or not he killed a person and whether or not that was premeditated. That's much easier for the state. So it really lightens the load for the prosecutors, I should say actually the New York County prosecutors, in terms of pushing this case to trial. That might be advantageous to get a conviction. Because the harder you make a case, the harder it is even to get a conviction, right? So that could be of some help, and that could ultimately be to the detriment of Mangione. The other thing that could be to his detriment is if you've now perked up the interest of the federal government and they think we have to push forward, because if we leave this to the state, he's going to end up in jail for 25 years and then with the possibility of parole. And we don't think that is a sufficient enough penalty for a premeditated murder, shooting someone in the back on Fifth Avenue.
Yeah, and I, remember covering this case. We discussed it during a panel at CrimeCon, and this case truly has people so divided. Are you surprised that the case has resonated with so many people, and are you surprised that there are still people supporting Luigi, even though prosecutors say there's a lot of evidence against him?
So I'm not surprised. I keep saying, and maybe I've said this to you before, Bonnie and Clyde had supporters and fans, right? And that was a different era. That was before social media. That was before it became so easy to be heard. So the idea that among the millions and millions of people who live in the United States, there are some who support Luigi Mangione. First of all, the idea that there are people who are angry at the insurance industry, totally unsurprising. Right. I'm a little angry at the insurance industry, right? I get that. So there's all that underlying context. There is an incredible interest in true crime stories, as you know better than anybody, right? So what you do for a living. And you put those together and you allow people to comment freely on social media, as I'm sure we'll get a lot of comments in response to this when it hits YouTube. We always do. So you get a lot of content, and I'm not surprised there are some who support him. I don't agree with those people, but I'm not surprised.
Yeah, and it was interesting too, because when we were doing our panel discussion, we were asking the audience who could possibly be jurors, maybe not if they attended CrimeCon, but we asked them, do you think Luigi Mangione is guilty? A lot of people raised their hands. And then some of those same people also raised their hands when they also said that they would nullify him in a jury or acquit him if they were to serve on the jury. So it's interesting to hear the thoughts of people and what they think about this case too, even though prosecutors say they have a lot of evidence against him. Rich Schoenstein, thank you so much for being here with me today. I really appreciate it, and making time for us today. It's always great to see you.
It's always great to see you and to be on here. Have a good day.
All right, thanks, Rich. Luigi Mangione's next hearing in Pennsylvania is scheduled for November 7th, and his next hearing in New York State Court is December 1st. Right now, it's unclear his next appearance in federal court. Thanks so much for joining us here on Law and Crime. I'm Elizabeth Millner.